It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second day of the conference. I hope you all had a nice evening after the reception. Did you all have a relaxing time last night? Ready for a new, very, very full day? Good. Okay. Louder. I can't hear you. Good. Okay, excellent. Thanks so much for being here. For those who have newly joined the webcast, my name is Muntasir Kamal, and I'm the program leader for the Maternal and Child Health Program, and which houses the Center of Excellence for CRVS Systems. And welcome to our web viewers as well. I have short housekeeping remarks before we start the session today. Once again, just please make sure that when you speak today in the Q&A period and then later in the labs today, that you're speaking to the mics, so for the with the mics, so we can have the interpretation work well. Also for our webcast viewers, please, we encourage you to participate in the Q&A sessions, part of the session. So please send your questions, and someone from the Center of Excellence will present it to the, will flag it to the moderators. I have a couple of other announcements for the steering committee of the conference to please meet at on the first break after this opening session. Steering committee for the conference, please meet during the coffee break. Also, a slight change in the agenda in the afternoon. We will start the last session at 3:45, not at 4 p.m. So the last break is half hour, not 45 minutes. This is not to torture everyone, but I think there is just so much that we'll need to cover in the last session, and we want to make sure that we have as many of you here as possible for that segment. So the afternoon, the last session starts at 3:45. And then the last announcement I have is on the statement. We had yesterday I mentioned that we are hoping to hear back from you if you have any comments or any objections by 8 a.m. today. So please, if you still have any comments or suggestions or objections, please let us know early this morning. Otherwise, it's not a threat, but because if we don't hear from you with any objections this morning, we will consider it as endorsed and present it at the final session of the conference. So without further ado, I want to introduce our session moderator, Dimitri Sanga. Dr. Sanga is currently the director of the Regional Office for West Africa of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Formerly, he served as the Commission as director of the African Center for Statistics. In this capacity, he contributed to the conceptualization, design, and operationalization of the Africa Program on Accelerated Improvement of Civil Registration and Vital Statistics. Prior to the United Nations, he was the senior economic statistician at Statistics Canada and part-time professor of economics at the University of Ottawa. He holds a PhD in econometrics, a master's in econometrics, and a bachelor in engineering from Laval University in Quebec, Canada. Please welcome Dimitri as the moderator for the next session.
Thank you, Master of Ceremony and colleagues. Good morning. We are starting a little bit late. Some of our colleagues were in a meeting and they had to join us. So let's quick start this session. We have been here for 2 days now, so more or less we know each other. I will not go into lengthy presentations or introduction of panelists. We have been discussing civil registration and vital statistics. And then we know many countries across the world are struggling to have functioning civil registration and vital statistics systems. And then when you add to that the fact that through the SDGs, we want to leave no one behind, you start looking at some of the marginalized groups, youth, women, elderly, and so on. On Monday, there was a lot of discussion around here on gender issues. So if you add to the fact that we are struggling to have functioning civil registration system, you add to that fact that we have to take into account a gender issue, and you add another layer, which is in emergency situations, it is a tall order. Yes, it is a tall order, but when I look at the proeminent panelists that I have here, I think that we can come out of here with at least, I'm saying at least because we can have more, two things. One, we have to get out of here with a sense of why is it important for us to look at gender issues in emergencies when we are dealing with civil registration. This is a kind of making the case for gender issues in emergency situations when we are dealing with civil registration. The second one is, it is good to say that it's an important issue. What are the innovations? What are the innovative ways of dealing with issues pertaining to gender in emergency situations in terms of civil registration? Without further ado, let me introduce very quickly the panelists, starting with Cornelius William, who is the Associate Director and Global Chief of Child Protection at UNICEF. Welcome, Cornelius.
Thank you.
Shaida Badiee is the Managing Director of Open Data Watch, an NGO focused on monitoring and promoting open data in national statistical offices. Most of you have met Shaida. She was formerly the manager, the director of the World Bank's Data Development Group. After Shaida, we have Rikke Hansen, who has worked for the United Nations for 18 years in the area of sustainable development policy analysis, program management, and evaluation and statistics. Oliver Chinganya is currently the director of the African Center for Statistics at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and is the one who is actually heading the secretariat of the Africa program on accelerated improvement of civil registration and managing the core group. Josie Perez is a deputy national statistician at the Census and Technical Coordination Office of the Philippine Statistics Authority. Welcome, Josie. Jean-Louis Ville is presently the head of the unit in charge of human rights, gender, and democratic governance at the European Commission in the Directorate of International Cooperation and Development. And last but not least, Anir, who is the policy advisor of UNDP and USAID in the Prime Minister's office in Bangladesh. I asked the panelists to stick to 5 slides in terms of presentation because I know that you would like to get the most of them with the Q&A. So we will go in that order and then give them 7 minutes to make their presentation so that we can open the floor. Cornelius.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dimitri. I decided to skip the slides because I'll get caught up in my slides and I'll break the rules and not meet the 7 minutes. But one of the things I wanted to talk about actually is, again, why is gender important in the overall development process? I'm not going to dwell on that. We all know the data is there, how important it is for women's level of education, how important it is actually their contribution to the economy, their contribution to health, etc. And the issue that we need to see the differences between men and women, boys and girls, and what they're contributing and who's benefiting from what and exclusion. In UNICEF, actually, we do support gender equity, and one of the issues is including the right of every child to be registered. In some countries, you'll see differences between who's registered and who's not registered, and who, what we would call, is a hidden population. Our strategic plan, which we started this year for the next 5 years, UNICEF has a gender action plan linked to it that tries to integrate gender across the 5 pillars of 5 goals area of a strategic plan. And the one where we have deepened the birth registration is the one on the each of the plans that has anything to do with inclusion. We feel it cuts across. There is one on health or survival. We feel that actually it cuts across. There is one on inclusion and social protection and social policy. We feel it cuts across. But let me jump straight to the issue of why the particulars of civil registration and vital statistics in gender issues in emergency situation. A lot has been spoken about gender issues in emergency. And I don't have the rate, but usually we do have the breakdown. And in most emergencies, between 75 and 80% are children and women, you know. And we have a lot of child-headed household, and we have a lot of women-headed household. Where are these refugees based? One, the whole of Syria, what we call the whole of Syria, is Syria plus the surrounding countries where the refugees are. We have Afghanistan, and again, you would link that to Pakistan. We also have Somalia and the Horn of Africa. These are where the big refugee populations are, and we also have the Lake Chad Basin. And the newest is the Rohingyas in Bangladesh. One of the issues is statelessness for this population. And women are particularly at risk of statelessness. They're particularly vulnerable, and their kids are particularly vulnerable. For example, under the Syrian and Jordanian law, nationality is passed to the father. So if a woman is a child-headed household, or if a woman is single and she's pregnant, she's not going to be able to get nationality in these countries, actually. If a Syrian woman gives birth in Jordan, if she doesn't have a marriage certificate, if you lose all your documents in a conflict, right, when you're fleeing, you'll definitely not be able to obtain a birth certificate for your child. And any unregistered child cannot prove their location of birth or family ties, which is required for nationality, so we would continue to have a growing stateless population. I was in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, and you could see the problem as it's going to grow. The vast majority of these women came without any husband or partners, and some of them were as young as 15. They are going to be stateless. Currently, they are stateless because they have not been given the granted designated as refugees. When the system breaks down, okay, as we saw in Ivory Coast when the system breaks down, if the system has an inbuilt bias against women, you know, issues like cultural bias, issues like some legal framework that is barring the woman, when we are building back, we need to address those bias. However, what we have seen is that people just go and build the same system again, okay, and doesn't take into consideration the sensitivity, the gender sensitivity. Portability. How can people move with their identity? We started talking about it, portability. How can people move with their identity? The other issue is actually the aid agencies have registration system. How can we build functional registration into that? Okay, so we have UNHCR, they're doing their registration. They're the ones actually that is best at functional registration. But WFP is also capturing information for cash transfers, for food aid. The health information is being captured, right? Are we thinking about how can we build portability into this and a functional system? Then the legal framework, right, as I said before, okay, if we're building back, we have to look at the legal framework. It's an opportunity. If there's a legal reform taking place in that country, because you would have the justice, law, and other sector doing a reform, you have to advocate that the building a reform of the CRVs. If there is Gender, there's usually peace and gender activities taking place together. You have to advocate for these women. The final point is we have to ensure the issue of missing women. In most of the conflicts, as I said, it's women-headed household. They form most of the displaced population. But sometimes when they go back, you know, the girls are missing, especially girls who are associated with the fighting forces. Their records are lost. Okay, nobody knows where they are. The fighters take them home. They don't release them, or they are trafficked. So if we don't take a deep look of where these children are or these women are, we'll not be able to address it.
Thank you very much, Cornelius. For those who know Shaida, they also know that she didn't not only head the data development group at the World Bank. She's actually working closely with Data2X, which is a team focused on closing gender data gaps. So we have the right person to talk to us about gender and emergencies. Please, Shaida.
Thank you. Really appreciate and glad to be here. When it comes, as Dimitri was saying, when it comes to gender data, we have a crisis, but then we also have emergencies, and then we also have well-functioning CRVS system. So putting it all together, as you said, it is a tall order. But there are success stories. We know, for example, in the case of combating the Ebola crisis with sex-segregated data is really a success example from crisis, where based on the death statistics and death registrations, it was obvious that there was the women were much more affected than men. And the local government and also the UN agencies acted on that, and there was an information campaign, and there's a success story from that, and lives were actually saved based on that data statistics. And here you see some of the information campaign here, and also the women who were involved locally were, and from UN women were actually awarded. So overall, for us, it's very important when we talk about the crisis or emergencies to have foundational data. And for that, we really need to have well-functioning CRVS. There is a lot of frameworks around, like SANDI, the disaster management information framework that the UN has blessed. And there are, of course, UNDP and UNICEF guidelines on various areas. But all it comes together, when you talk about gender and emergencies, it comes to these areas that I've highlighted on these slides, that women need assistance and protection. They need protection not only for physical protection and, of course, access, but they also need protection of civil and political and socioeconomic rights. But most importantly, close to my heart, is to have timely and accurate data to identify at-risk population. And, of course, inclusion of women and girls in decision-making in the process of the emergencies and decision-making is tremendously important. And I think UNICEF and others who deal with these situations and UNHCR are very well aware of that. But to deal with all these things, a lot of organizations usually come with short-term interventions, you know, sometimes maybe even Band-Aid treatments. But what I'm advocating for is a strong, well-functioning CRVS system should be a foundation for all this. And in fact, in many of the frameworks, we need to go back and make sure that the CRVS is very well represented in, let's say, SANDI and some of the guidelines from the UN. So having said that, and I think you're all here for CRVS, so you probably appreciate this. But you know, let's now quickly turn attention to the CRVS and looking at CRVS through the lens of women and girls. You know, a lot of you are CRVS experts, they are CRVS advocates, But looking at that through the women and girls lens, I think is tremendously important. I've tried to summarize in this slide, and with the help of Data2X, and we actually have a pamphlet that's going around that summarizes some of these issues. I know you all know it, but having it all together and seeing it in one place, that makes, that I think is quite powerful. And for the birth registration and legal identity, and a lot of these elements of the CRVS, it's very important to keep in mind who's behind it. For example, we have a story for the birth registration of a story of Ruby, is actually a girl from Kenya who had a birth from Bangladesh and who had a birth certificate, and in fact used the birth certificate to show that she was 15, which is not a marriage age, and she was able to avoid child marriage. And this is very important because 1 out of 3 girls, in fact, are affected by child marriage. And of course, for the marriage and divorce and the death registration, as you know, it brings a lot of benefits. We have another example of a marriage registration that, if you or a death registration of a woman called Blessing in Kenya, and Blessing actually had the death registration of her husband, and she was a young woman and was able to get access to land and to some financial services as a result of that. So behind all this, there are stories of women, and in fact, my group actually collects these stories. So if you have any of these impact stories, we would really glad to be collecting them. So moving on, we know the benefits of the women, and we know the benefits of this CRVS, but we all know also the crisis that we have in the state of the CRVS, weak CRVS systems in many countries. I would not summarize this. Some of these statistics is very close to what is being covered already, and we know the state of the play in the world. But the good news is on the demand side, we see the SDGs are putting a lot of emphasis on the importance of CRVS. And we're all counting how many SDGs actually need them. My count is 25 of the targets actually are reliant on CRVS systems. And then you will see on the supply side, there is a weak system. So something has to be done about that. And we are very glad that this past few days we've been, particularly on Monday, there was this session that we had on making the invisible visible, and congratulations to the Center of Excellence for bringing us all together. And it was bringing the diverse group of researchers. We had the gender experts, we had the CRVS experts all in the room. And we identified a number of knowledge gaps that need to be filled in, and we heard a lot of commitments actually from organizations that walked away to make sure that gender is mainstream into the work that they do going forward on CRVS. And of course, we all came together on the same page as what are some of the challenges and priorities that we have to deal with. I will not go through the summary of key messages, but just the sort of the highlight of that we need to prioritize better fundraising and financing for both, of course, gender and sex disaggregated data, and also for CRVS, and bringing it together to build that strong system to serve the emergency and other situations is fundamental. Partnership was tremendously important, and we are very happy to see the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, who's bringing over 300 partners from public, private, and academics all together so that we can all see what we can do more than just individually. Knowledge and research, and this is very close to, I think, a lot of you are into the knowledge and research area, that there is so much that we don't know. We don't know of the barriers that women face, and overall, so we need to do more work on research and knowledge sharing and data, of course, and open data. As you know, I'm an advocate of open data. And then sort of the balancing, all the things that we need to do, the balance between the ID, innovation, building sound CRVS systems, and balancing between all the elements of the CRVS system from birth to marriage, divorce, and death registration. So final slide is the moving ahead. It looks very positive. We're looking at here being in IDRC and looking at Center of Excellence, bringing us all together. And we're going to be summarizing and bringing the outcome of the Monday's seminar forward. And there's also another session around the UN Statistical Commission that is being organized, and share the document and pass the world on. And I know many of you probably are not in the gender data specifically. You're in your own areas of work, but making a plea from here for a moment that whatever you do, look through the gender lens and sort of see how that work can be better mainstreaming the gender dimensions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shaida. Very clear example on how taking into account gender issues can really improve development outcomes. You need to prove, if you are talking about early marriage, you need to have some proof of the age of the person. Even death registration, a woman who is married and who cannot prove that the husband is dead, and then in terms of succession and so on, it needs both a marriage certificate and then the death certificate of the spouse. So these are key issues that are really important. So let's move to Rikke.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, and good morning to all of you. Looking at the topic for this morning's discussion, I thought that I would try to unpack the various concepts a little bit to hopefully help us structure our discussions around the topic of CRVs, gender, disasters, emergencies. So what I will do is to speak to the links between the concepts in pairs. And I will start with disasters and gender. Some of our speakers have already clearly mentioned examples of why gender is an issue in disaster and emergency situations. Just a few specific data. Well, women and children are 14 times more likely than men to die during a disaster. We saw, for example, in the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004 that women in many villages in Aceh, in Indonesia, and in parts of India accounted for over 70% of the dead. Women and children face greater risk and exposure due to their lower socioeconomic status and also the caregiving role that many women take on. For example, in situations of droughts, we see that men may migrate for work and women and children are left and to much higher exposure to the risks related to drought situations. I have replaced the word emergency with disasters here because I think it's important from the perspective of gender concerns to realize that we observe gender equality and gender issues are relevant to all phases of disasters, also long before emergencies actually occur. So looking at the various phases, including risk assessments, mitigation, preparedness, in addition to impact, response, and recovery through the gender lens is needed in order for us to also adjust planning and recovery of systems after disasters, as has already been pointed out by one of the presenters. Let me move on to the link between CRVs and gender, where we did have some very good detailed discussions Monday this week. We see that there are at least two sides to CRVs and gender. we see examples, and Shaida has just highlighted some of them, that CRVS can empower women and girls. On the other hand, we also see that gender biases can hamper CRVS in terms of putting well-functioning CRVS systems in place. We've had the examples of gender-biased legal frameworks mentioned already. There are also certain stigmas surrounding, for example, births outside marriages, which in some cases lead to relatives registering the birth of children. And one of the implications of that is that eventually we will have incorrect patterns and information on fertility, for example. Moving on to CRVS and disasters. I would also argue that there are many different sides to this. One aspect is to make sure that CRVS systems are resilient in the way they are designed, in the way that operating procedures are laid out. We have to make sure that documents can be replaced in emergency situations and in the recovery phase. We need to make sure that CRVS systems can continue to function during and after emergencies, being able to perform the services that they are meant to perform. Also, for example, among displaced populations. This topic was the focus of an event organized by the Pacific Civil Registers Network in Fiji in October last year, and I've stolen some of the recommendations from that meeting and put the points on this slide. But it is a discussion that is going on, and I believe that we will hear much more about CRVS and disasters going forward. There is also the other side, that CRVS systems generate information that can be very useful, potentially, for planning, for assessing disaster risks. Shaida mentioned the Sendai framework. In that context, there's a lot of work going on focusing on statistics and disasters. And there is, at the moment, a disaster-related statistics framework being developed to support countries, among others, in planning for disaster situations. Within that framework, we are looking at potential uses of information from CRVS systems, for example, to develop population hazard exposure maps. And one of the issues that have also come up in the discussion surrounding developing this framework is that it's very important after disasters to make sure that the information in disaster situations that are often collected and processed by disaster management agencies feed back into updating the various administrative registers and systems. I put the link on this slide if anyone wants to have a closer look at the framework that's under development. You're very welcome, and we would be very happy to get some insights and inputs from you. So finally, putting everything together, I believe here that I mostly repeat points made by the first couple of speakers. But whether we look at gender, CRVS, disaster, all three of them, 2 and 2, the starting point is to recognize that women and girls constitute a vulnerable group and think that through. When we talk about gender concerns and resilience, build it into CRVS systems development and improvements, integrate those concerns into disaster risk reduction efforts, and enhance gender statistics on all phases of disasters. Statistics, as well as research, that has been pointed out, is something that is really scarce. When I was trying to look for very hard facts for this presentation, I did fall short. Once we move away from the immediate impacts of disaster, it becomes rather anecdotal. So I think that there is a real task that we could hopefully work together to lift. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rikke. Let's move to Oliver.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. Chair, if you may allow me, and I would like to steal a minute and a half of the discussion, with your permission, just to somewhat discuss the implementation arrangement and also where we draw the mandate of implementing the CRVs on the continent. Because we have referred to the core group, and people don't even know what we mean by a core group, and we talked about the APES. So if you can, 1.5 minutes before you get into time. As the Chair did mention, the coordination of the CRVs is within the African Center for Statistics and working very closely with other Pan-African institutions, the ADB and also the AUC. But in addition to that, we're working very, very closely with what we've been referring to as the core group. And I just want to mention who are these people that constitute the core group. We have UNICEF, we have WHO, UNFPA, In-Depth Network, Perez 21, Vital Strategies, Plan International, UNHCR, and the Center of Excellence. And recently, we also got a request from JFF that they would like to become part of the members of this particular core group. But this coordination is within a framework that we call the Pan-African Program on Acceleration of Improvement for CRVs, which basically draws this mandate from the ministers responsible for CRVs on the continent, who meet every 2 years. And the last meeting that having been in December last year. And one of the things that was done or concluded at that particular meeting was the approval of the strategic plan that runs for 5 years from last year, 2017. But of course, we have not started effecting the implementation of it. Most of it is going to be starting this year, so it's likely to be ending in 2018. And as part of this mandate that we draw, one of the things that was agreed also within the strategic plan is that we would have a secretariat that runs this program. And so far, we have begun the process of recruiting the staff to implement or become part of the secretariat so that we are able to implement the program as effective as possible. And also to mention that one of the things that was concluded by the heads of states and government in 2016 was a declaration of 2017 to 2026 as a decade of repositioning CRVs in Africa. So you can see the political commitment that is already there at the top level in implementing the program. And finally, I just wanted also to mention that we have recently set up a committee of registrar generals. And many times, these registrar generals, they had to get their voice through the national statistical offices. And we thought that there was need to put up a registrar generals committee who can now really, speak on themselves in terms of the challenges that they face when they are taking up these events that they are registering. So their first meeting of a task force was in October last year. And their first meeting, so to speak, was also on the margins of the ministers' meeting that was held in Nouakchott last year. I must mention also that in all this, in addition to the core group, we also work with others. For instance, Statistics Norway, just to recognize that they've been part of some of the work that we do, as well as a very close collaboration with UNESCAP for the work that we do. So, Chair, I just wanted to share that very, very briefly before I get into my presentation. Now, Chair, what I've done is I've looked at followed up your presentation on the 3 issues that you wanted us to discuss, and this is on the development, gender in development, what is important about it, gender in emergencies situations, and finally, I also want to look at what can we do in resolving some of these issues. So I think it's established, and I think in the last 2.5 days, 2 days that we've been here, including for those that were here on Monday, that any policy that is developed without taking into account the gender dimension leads to very, very poor and ineffective policy making in the country that actually render to a very large extent and perpetuating certain things like poverty and so forth, and not being able to reduce even poverty. It's also established that as much as we know that gender is the right, we know that the benefits of gender, as we heard from Shaida and also from Rikke, that if we include the gender dimensions in the policy development, it really brings a lot of economic benefits. And that's the reason the other day we are arguing and advocating for, can we come up with a study to actually see the economic and the social value for gender in economic development. But unfortunately, in a situation in Africa that these benefits are not the same between men and women, and to a large extent you actually see a hell lot of disadvantage on the part of the women. And as other colleagues have already said before me, you can see that if we talk about education, there's actually an old adage that says that if you educate a woman in a village, you actually educate everyone. We heard that also this morning. We also know very well in agriculture, because they are the largest unpaid employees, and if they're taken into account properly, there is a lot of benefits that can be accrued out of there. We see a similar situation if there's a high level of women participation in employment. There is a lot of benefits that goes to accrue in terms of economic development. But when we look at the situation in situations of emergency, again, the two colleagues that spoke before me, they were able to illustrate very clearly that in these situations, the many times the people that are actually disadvantaged are women. And of course, we know there are also men that get disadvantaged, but the biggest people that the biggest number or the largest proportion that is seriously disadvantaged are women. For the situation that we've had in Africa, we have a situation where people have been affected with conflicts, situations of health hazards. We heard about the Ebola, somebody already alluded to that. And making the population invisible, and particularly the women themselves, they're not able to have the necessary information that is required to be captured in the process. And therefore it becomes very essential that having a well-functioning civil registration in all situations becomes inevitable. We have to have a situation or a civil registration system that works that to be able to capture all this information. But then what do we need to do to address some of these situations? First of all, I think there's an issue that was raised about having a very robust legal framework. And before then, really what we need is that can we put in place or establish innovative and integrated systems that allow for those that are victimized in those situations to be able to still access and also to be able to provide the necessary that is required. Of course, the legal framework that has already been mentioned, but more importantly, I think investing in more innovative and affordable processes in countries under all situations. But again, the other bigger part is having a national system that recognizes and works very closely with other agencies that are responsible for people in these kinds of situations. So, in brief, really, that those are my thoughts. But I think, in conclusion, it's clear, and again from what has been said by Shaida and Rikke, that without a well-functioning system that is supported with a necessary legal framework, that is supported with a necessary innovative and investment, we will not be able to do much. And especially for a continent like Africa, where we have two agendas that have to be we have to deal with, Agenda 2063 and also Agenda 2030, it then becomes necessary that we have a framework that is able to respond to the emergency issues at all times. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Oliver. And then I would like colleagues to bear with me as the chair. I use my prerogative as the chair to let Oliver talk for 2 more minutes for a program that is at the heart of what I did at the African Center for Statistics. So thank you, Oliver. Josie.
Good morning. I would like to present the gender and emergencies with respect to, in relation to CRVs in the Philippines. In the case of development process, the population is the most, plays a vital role. And of this population group, the women and the children are the most vulnerable and affected whenever there's something happening in the society. Their survival and living conditions and health are of utmost importance to society. Hence, their rights, welfare, and development are always at the core of the country's social development goals. While we can say that in the Philippines, women is gaining grounds, but still, there are challenges and hardship that they are facing at homes, schools, and workplaces, and they continue to bear as witness to unresolved gender inequalities. In the Philippines, we have the Philippine Commission on Women. This was established during the time of our First Lady President, sometime in the 80s. Okay. And in the establishment of the Philippine Commission on Women, we had this, the Magna Carta of Women was enacted. And through this Magna Carta of Women, all the rights of the women were stated and specified. And then there is this Philippine Plan for Gender Responsive Development. Okay. Aside from the different plans, government agencies also allotted 5% every year, 5% of their total budget to gender-related activities. There is also, in the PSA, we established the Interagency Committee on Gender and Children's Statistics. This is headed by the chief of the PCW, or the Philippine Commission on Women. And then we have one PSA board resolution and joining different agencies to promote gender concerns through the generation of statistics. Okay. Now, what are the particularities of civil registration and vital statistics in the Philippines in relation to emergency situations? Women and children whose age are falsified in documents, specifically those serving as overseas Filipino workers. There are children 15 years old, sometimes their age are changed in order for them to enter as OFWs. But this is not known to the government. This will be known only to the government when something happens to them. Okay? And then women, especially children who are victims of armed conflict displaced and orphans, such as the armed conflict that happened in Marawi City last year. Marawi City is located in Mindanao. Okay, there was this a Muslim rebels or terrorists that invaded the city, and the government intervened. And most of the population, all the population inside the city were displaced to the nearby provinces. Okay. And then another one is the death of women and children who are victims of violence, specifically the OFWs. Before I left the country, there was a news about a woman who worked in Kuwait, and she was murdered by her employer 2 years ago, and she was placed in a freezer, and they found her body only recently, and that made our president outrageous and called for the support of the Kuwait government to pursue for the criminals. The husband and the husband and his wife was accomplice to this crime. And then women and children losing civil register documents during calamities, like in the case of Typhoon Haiyan, where so many municipalities in 2 provinces were affected. And the PSA collaborated with the local government in order for the civil registers to be reconstructed or re-established, okay? And also in the case of incidents of fire, if all these documents were burned down, what we do is collaborate with them also to help them reconstruct their civil register. And for the last one, what innovative responses do you foresee to address civil registration, CRVs, and gender issues in emergency solution? One is strengthening the local civil registration. As of now, the rich municipalities, citizen municipalities, they have computers. They do some computerization of the civil register, but this is not enough. They need to be taught on how to have backups, not in their municipalities, but in other. Today, the only backups that they have is the one that they have given to the PSA. So we are able to help them also, and the PSA is also making backups of this copy and placing this in other places outside the Philippines. Okay, and then if the national ID will be pushed through, and we can link this in PSA CRS records with different agencies such as the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Office of Philippine Overseas Employment Authority, the Bureau of Immigration, and the Welfare Administration in charge of helping the OFWs to address the following concerns. One is the registration of legitimate children of OFWs. Second is the verification of birth documents of OFW women and children, especially those who are service providers. Registration of births and fetal deaths to teenage mothers. Verification of birth records of young women engaged to foreign nationals. And verification of birth records of stateless women and children in nearby countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josie. Let's very quickly move to Jean-Louis Ville.
Thank you. Good morning. I'll skip the presentation, so no slides, so this is a good point. So I speak a bit more, Mr. Moderator, I suppose. And I'll steal one of the diagram of Rikke. I'll concentrate my intervention on the 2 elements, gender and emergencies, less on CRVs. But what? And I perhaps will take the angle from the emergency angle first, which is coming from what we do in humanitarian aid at European level through our ECHO colleagues. I'm not working with ECHO, I'm working with development, but we are very closely linked, and we are cousins in that way. But I'd like to take their views on, if I may, for a couple of seconds, to see from emergency point of view how things are things. First of all, perhaps I'd like to recall a few things, that identification is the necessary basis for any kind of development initiative. I think it has been stated several times during these days, so I will not be long. As I said on Monday, no paper, no existence, no rights. So meaning this is absolutely key in our conceptions of what we do. We have 2 frames we work under at European Commission. One is the European Consensus for Development, which is based on rights-based approach and recognizes gender as one of the core value through and we want to ensure that through mainstreaming of all policies and program we have this dimension of leave no one behind, taken on board, be it for ethnicity or gender reasons. And the second element, which is framing our policies, is the Gender Action Plan, where we have two objectives that I've mentioned already. Sorry for those who attended the meeting on Monday. They listened to something they've already heard, which is ensuring equal access for girls and women to all levels of quality education and vocational training. This is important because it has consequences when it comes to emergencies, and of course ensure equal rights and ability for women to participate in policy and governance. So, this being said, women and girls must be registered and identified at birth, if not at the other events of their life, because it's the prerequisite for the implementation of our policies. Now, when it comes to emergencies, we do have also a frame, and our guidance on gender makes references to the importance of support of documentation in emergency situation. This was already illustrated by distinguished predecessors on this panel, and I think in a couple of discussions that we had yesterday. Document-related measures that we support include civil documentations and restoration of lost civil documentation. This is part of our first problems, or the first needs we would like to cope. Of course, when we are talking about refugees and displaced persons, they need a roof, they need to eat, but immediately after that, you have to identify who they are, because UNHCR and us are registering the refugees or the displaced persons so that we know who they are and where they come from. And this is where it comes to the identification. If the people who arrived have a document of any kind, it helps. If they don't, then we start having a serious problem, as it was already said. Because, I mean, having a document or an identity means that we can build on that for all kinds of things: education, cash transfer, support, emergency aid, food, etc. If they don't, and all the legal and all the events of their life, we've spoken about marriages, birth in refugee camps. Of course, there are issues related to that, but I mean, the frame is missing. So we see the reality, and this is the Syrian case that was illustrated, where a coping mechanism among the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, for instance, or in Jordan, is to marry the young girls, because this is a way for them to survive. Sorry to be perhaps a bit brutal, but this is how reality is. And this was perceived immediately at the start of the crisis by UN Women. I remember they were extremely concerned about this, but nevertheless, it's a fact of life. Now, of course, there's a child protection dimension in it, that we agree. We all fight against child marriages and early marriages. But nevertheless, I mean, what if it happens? We have to reconstitute the legality of the stay. It has impact on living conditions, because people are or not allowed to stay in the country. And of course, it entails everything that was said about the consequences for the family, for the whole legal status of the persons. Now, of course, it can be mitigated through other measures. Registration of marriages will certainly help. We can help in providing support in healthcare and reproductive healthcare. But I mean, these are only elements. They are not the solution. They're just trying to tap into the things. Now, if we come to the need for registration, I said this is an obligation, and this is what we collectively do in the various situation. And it must be considered, or it should be considered, as the first step of protection, because otherwise we are nowhere. And this is absolutely relevant for gender and girls, the women and girls particularly. Now, a few things. I promise not to be long. I don't want to get the yellow card. Fortunately, it's not a red one. But a few things I'd like to see. We have now projects. We're supporting to register the 1 million Rohingya refugees with the UNHCR, providing photos, fingerprints, and addresses, so try to map this population. And of course, that will give them an identity and existence for a population which is very much what I would call a disenfranchised population. And it will allow us to identify the fragile and the vulnerable groups, women, children, etc. And there are a lot of consequences behind that because, of course, having registered people, you can provide them with cash transfer or cards for having food. Yes. 1 minute, I got the yellow card. But of course, as we all know, it's not equal to civil registration. This is, again, another track, another event that is happening, another way to grasp a situation. And this is part of the problem, I would say, because although it's a good thing per se, when we have to coordinate it, and then how do we link it with the others, it becomes the issue. I don't get into the merit of civil registration. I think it has been extensively explained, so it's not for me to do, but just to say that as European Union, we are getting into that field. We are new, as I said. We are supporting projects now in Mali, in Niger, Senegal, and a few other countries, Malawi, if I'm correct, where we believe this is part of what the government should do and must do. So we are happy to enter into it through the governance angle. Last thing I'd like to say on registration, not on civil registration, but on refugees or IDPs. Don't forget, I mean, we need a framework for data protection. I'm sorry for that. I was extremely enthusiastic about our Chilean colleagues yesterday when you spoke about this. But I mean, it's a data. It's personal data, and it can be misused. I spoke about the Rohingya we are now supporting. In 1992, we did the same with the consequences that the military junta of Myanmar at that time used this information to just cancel the existence of this population, so to say there were no rights to come back to the country. So let's face, it's sometimes the two sides of the same coin, and for that we definitely need a legal framework which is resistant and resilient. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Louis. Last and not least, Anir, please, and then we give the opportunity to colleagues to ask questions. We're doing well.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As the last speaker of the session, maybe I'll just jump to conclusion directly. So 2 conclusions. One is that I think it's important to look at the situation of gender and emergencies through the lens of the affected individuals, each individual. That's one conclusion. And VS driving civil registration is not the way to look at it. The second conclusion is that we need to bring significant innovations through business process reengineering, disruptive technologies, and unprecedented coordination. So those are the 2 conclusions. Let me see how much time left for the slides. Now, if I had more time, I would go through this in a bit more detail, but this is the regular CRVS. Different events happening from birth to death, and different agencies being involved in that process. So health, the education system, we have 2 ministries of education, which became 3, in fact. We have 3 ministries of education now. The voter ID system, which is done by our election commission, and the CRVS events along the way. Many agencies are involved. And whose lens are we really looking at? It is the citizens' lens. In the case of emergencies, it's actually more than citizens. It's affected individuals, displaced persons. Are we looking at it from the government's lens or the development partners' lens? I will not go over this in too much detail. I think my previous speakers have already talked about the criticality of civil registration in the case of emergencies as far as gender is concerned. From the context of Bangladesh, perspective of Bangladesh, we are a climate vulnerable country. The number varies from 5 to 6, but we are in the top. We have floods and cyclones every year. And the recent Rohingya influx from Myanmar adds to the crisis situation. Let me talk about a few innovations that have helped significantly, and also helped in general for CRVS, but also helped in emergency situations. In 131 years, between 1873 and 2004, we were able to register 8% of our population. That number went up to 90% in about 13 years. So we achieved 100 times efficiency. So in terms of number of years, it became 1/10. In terms of population coverage, it became 10 times. So what happened? A few significant innovations. One is introduction of the electronic birth and death registration system. And we had permanent storage. If the document gets lost, you can actually reissue new ones. So that's what happened. We created about 4,500 rural digital centers run by entrepreneurs. So this was an interesting innovation because they were housed in government offices, but were run by entrepreneurs to overcome the situation of not having the right technical HR in rural areas. We linked a lot of this issue to service delivery. So we saw the number go from a few percent in terms of 45 days after birth to 80% of birth registration during school enrollment around the age of 6. So the linking to service delivery was important. And then recent linking to biometrically verified national ID, that was also helpful because that, again, we don't need documents in the case of emergencies because you can use biometrics. Now, a few innovations that we're trying now in the last 1 year with support from Vital Strategies and Bloomberg. We're linking health with our local government registrars. So essentially, health workers are going from door to door, collecting birth information, birth registration data, and sending that electronically to our registrars at the local level. And the next linking that we're doing right now is to send that notification to our National ID Authority, which is our election commission. So that linking is going to bring another level of efficiency in the system. We also introduced at the rural level medically certified cause of death in facilities and verbal autopsy, which is bringing up death registration and cause of death statistics. I'll give you very quickly some slides. So we saw within 45 days, birth registration was only about 3 or 4%. That number went up to about 30+% in the recent 1 year. Death registration went from 0% to over 90%. Cause of death, for the first time, we're actually getting accurate cause of death data through the medically certified cause of death in facilities and verbal autopsy in communities. So the way we are looking at CRVS in Bangladesh, which is helping with emergency situations, is to connect CRVS to IDs and to a platform that we're calling Integrated Service Delivery Platform. So it's basically 6 things. It's a database of different IDs into one. So it's convergence of all ID systems into one ID. Central authentication, it's one authentication mechanism that everybody will use. Publishing of technical and interoperability standards that, again, many agencies are using. A platform that connects, that's really the ISDP platform that we're working on right now. And a data analytics and visualization platform that supports our VS. And surrounding all of this is a coordination mechanism that we set up at our cabinet office, headed by the cabinet secretary himself, which basically brings in the entire bureaucracy under one umbrella. A few recent innovations of using mobile financial accounts, again, linking to mother's accounts. This was important in case of emergencies. So money transfers are happening electronically more and more within the country. The realization that we have is the information that we collect for civil registration is not enough for emergency situations. We need a lot more nuanced information for dealing with emergencies. Who are we actually sending what kind of response to? Food or livestock support, which ones are actually needed? We need to understand that a lot more in-depth way. Let me talk a little bit very quickly about the Rohingya situation. Sure. The Rohingya situation, I think previous speakers have talked about that. It's not a new situation. It actually flared up recently. It's been happening since the 70s. So in the 20 years between 70s and 90s, we had about 250,000 Rohingyas coming in, but most of them were actually sent back. The recent influx, over 600,000 actually, in the last few months, and we have over 1 million right now, about 50% male and 50% female. About 37% are underage. So registration has been done by several organizations, 2 biometric registrations, one by our Department of Immigration and Passports and also HCR. So we have sex desegregated data, but we don't have birth information in an accurate way because they can't really tell when they were born. So we don't have, so that's a big problem that we have. We're not deduplicating this information because we don't have the technical capability of doing it, which basically means we're not getting full advantage of biometric registration. We can actually do multiple registration using biometric. Let me go quickly. The incentives that we see, so the positive incentive is that they get food, non-food items, health services by registering. But the fear that they have is that they'll be sent back, which they don't want to, and which happened 20 years ago. That they were sent back, and actually the people that came back, a lot of them were probably in Bangladesh already. One story I want to just share very quickly. Can I have 1 minute? Just 1 more minute. 50 seconds. 50 seconds, thank you. So we have a lot of people, Biharis, who came from India, different parts of India that have been here since the independence of Bangladesh, 45 years or so. And a recent ruling in 2008 made the ones who were born in Bangladesh as citizens. But they don't have addresses. They live in camps. So this is one situation that we're dealing with. And with the Rohingyas, although we're saying that they'll be repatriated, it may take many years, actually. So that is the reality. And we have to think about whether they'll become, in some form, citizens of Bangladesh, at least the ones that are getting born in Bangladesh. The last one that I just want to mention, we're looking at new technologies where we're merging IDs, portable IDs, which becomes financial ID, biometric ID, and communication ID through mobile phones. We're looking at blockchains, and we're developing a platform for smartphones for the illiterate population, which will serve in emergency situations. And my last slide, just 10 seconds. 7 questions that I'd like to, 5 seconds. 7 questions I'd like to actually place before you. Again, looking at the specific needs of emergency situations. So we need to design the right responses. So short-term, long-term, who has access to data? How will we share data across agencies? So again, the last 2 things that I want to share is that, again, CR should be designed by the needs of the individual, so not by the needs of vital statistics. And coordination and storage of data and how we interoperate this data, create portable IDs, this is also very important in emergency situations. Thank you very much. Thanks for giving that.
Colleagues, thank you very much. You have seen that we had quite a variety of competencies on the panel, very rich. But I think the moment you are waiting is this one, where you will have to ask them questions. I organized this session in a way that they had to respond to 3 questions. One is, why is gender important in the overall development process? And second is, what are the particularities of gender issues, gender in emergencies in terms of CV registration? And third, what are the innovations? So let me take 2 questions on this side, in the middle, and on the other side. That means 6. And I would like to have gender balance, please. 2 on this side. Raj, I would like to have a woman on this side. I already have one. It's gender balance. Is there any burning issue from a woman on this side? Okay. In the middle, a woman? No. Right? Okay, let's go with Raj. And then second in the middle. And then on the other side. Okay, Raj.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think some of the speakers, it was really a wide range of wide-ranging presentation, covering almost all aspects of gender and emergency. But I think the important point Cornelius was making was, even in peace times, when there's no emergency, the important point is to register every child. so that, it's not an emergent reactionary system. It's a normal system. You have to register every child so that in terms of when the time comes, there is no problem. You have a certificate. Now, particularly the birth. Now, if you look at the processes and the legal systems that are existing in the countries, we have made registration very, very complicated. The register of birth was meant to record the birth of a child occurring to a mother at a certain place and a certain date. But we have complicated it. And we have complicated it for the mothers. Because if the child is born out of the wedlock, like most of the South African countries, you will see 50% of the child are registered without the name of the father. So the onus, the father is escaping. Although the law says a live birth is a product of expulsion and extraction of a product of conception of the mother. For the father is not defined at all. Father is not there at all in the scene. So I think the registration purpose we are losing. And what we are making is we are trying to make the registration record as a record of proof of paternity, as a record of proof of nuptiality, which is a wrong approach. And then the onus comes on the mother to prove many things. If you're married, you bring a marriage certificate. In a country where there are only 10% marriage registration, how do you go and back to a civil court to do a marriage registration retrospectively? So these are impediments that we have to remove. And who is facing the problem? The problem is the mother who is facing the problem. The father, when the child is born out of wedlock, the father doesn't come to the registration center at all. So if there is a limit by which the child has to be registered, 45 days or 30 days, it is the mother who has to come. I think we have to remove impediments for the mother. And that's the most important thing. And the birth registration record is not a record of proof, a conclusive proof of paternity or nuptiality. I think we have to remove this impediment if you have to improve registration. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. I finally got the gender balance on this side. Please, go ahead.
It's me, Raj. Don't be surprised. Here I am. Come on, girls, where are we? I'm actually going to pose it's a question for Anir, but more a reflection from our first day. So on our first day, we talked about inclusion of women in the design of systems. And I think we've returned a lot to the theme of women being, vulnerable in the context of emergencies, particularly this morning, or in other contexts, in migrant workers, that was a really great example. But we haven't returned really to the theme about women being involved in the design and the improvement and the reduction of barriers and impediments to civil registration. So I've got a question for Anir, because you mentioned linking the health workers with the local registrars, which I noted down in my notes as a local innovation. But when I look at that, health workers, tell me, how many of these are women? And the second question from that is, are you involving those women, the health workers, as part of the design process in the local communities? I think this speaks to some of our stuff on human-centred design as well. So just a question.
Thank you very much. We had a question in the middle here, please.
Thanks a lot. Ramesh Silva from the UN Population Fund. Thanks to all the speakers for a lot of really important insights. And I wanted to sort of pull together a few issues and propose a potential innovation, which I think comes out in a number of the talks. I think what we're seeing is that humanitarian situations are increasingly becoming sub-regional issues. If we think of the whole of Syria approach, Lake Chad region, and also the situation with DR Congo. And I think a number of speakers mentioned that these kinds of emergencies involve displacement, household dissolution, family members being separated, ID documents being lost. And I think and then there's also this issue of the incongruence between short-term incentives and disincentives around registration of vital events when people are displaced, and the long-term incentives around registration. And so I wanted to kind of suggest that perhaps there's some solutions here, not just on the technological side, but on the sort of regional and sub-regional cooperation side in terms of at least sensitizing neighboring countries and civil registration authorities to the practices in other countries as a disaster preparedness or a humanitarian preparedness approach. We see in the current day Syria context that it's very hard to register the child of a birth if you don't have your marriage certificates if you've been displaced in Jordan and Lebanon. And so I think that there's a need here for sensitization of local authorities and host communities, and perhaps innovative solutions to more streamlined civil registration processes in emergency situations. We do a lot of streamlining in all other facets of humanitarian work. Why not civil registration?
Thank you very much. Let's give an opportunity to the lady there.
Thank you very much. This has been very interesting, but my question, like my colleague on the other side, is broader than just humanitarian emergency situations. And that is that particularly in countries where women are, the status of women is poor, at both legal status and social status, and their chances of being registered in any kind of formal civil registration system is much lower than that of any other male person in their family. It is not just larger humanitarian emergencies, but individual emergencies in the lives of women where civil registration really counts. So if her marriage is not registered and she is not registered as a citizen and her husband dies, she can be disenfranchised from all his property by his family. She can be disenfranchised from her children. She can be separated from her children by his family. And so many other individual emergencies. And are the systems that we are thinking about able to respond to the individual emergencies in women's lives, where if a woman did not have her marriage registered, was not registered herself, does not have her children registered to her as the mother, how can the systems respond to those kinds of emergencies in the lives of women, which actually may be a larger problem than individual humanitarian emergencies?
Yes, thank you very much. And we don't have time, so I'll start with Anir because there was a specific question to him. Very quickly, in 30 seconds, a response to that, and then we can go around. Yes, please.
I could hear the question one more time. The second one, you had two questions.
Yes, please.
Very quickly.
Very quickly.
Sorry.
Sorry, so how many of the health workers that are notifying are women in general, and are you including women or those health workers as part of the consultation processes on your new processes?
Sure. I don't have the number exactly, how many of our health workers. We have about 60,000 or so health workers who go from door to door. Majority are women. Exactly, I don't know what the number is. In terms of consultation, we are involving the health workers and the local administration in designing the new data transfer process. So they are involved quite a bit. Okay,
thank you. Let's move. If you can address any issue that came from the floor or last word, 30 seconds, please. In that order.
I will not take, I didn't feel addressed by, I was concerned about everything, including by the very last one, which is the issue. From a gender perspective, of course, we are trying to build systems, but there are individuals at the very bottom of it. I'm not sure of the answer, to say the least.
In the case of the Philippines, the registration of marriage is through the solemnizing officer. If they do not register such marriage, their license will not be renewed. And then for those who have not married, or usually an annual mass marriage is being done in some municipalities, sponsored by the head of the municipalities in the Philippines.
Thank you. Oliver?
Quickly, Chair, and really I think it's continuous innovation, I think is the key, particularly to alleviate the situation of women. Thank you.
Thank you, Rikke.
Just a brief comment, particularly as a reflection on the intervention from, or the question from Raj, as well as the last person who had a question. The idea of focusing on birth registration and saying, well, it is actually a duty of the state to make this easy for everyone. I think it's very important to keep it in mind. Let's not put the burden on the mothers who have to register. So I just wanted to repeat your point there, Raj. The last question in terms of individual emergencies, I do believe that we need to integrate gender concerns when we talk about disasters, when we talk about CRVS, but let's not pretend that CRVS is a solution to a lot of the other issues, other gender issues in society. We can do our best to make sure that these systems are not perpetuating the existing gender inequalities, but it's not a solution to everything. Although I fully understand where the question is coming from, but I think we also need to balance things a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you, Shaida.
I really like Romesh's proposal for the regional sub-regional collaboration and streamlining registration during crisis. Let's take that as one of the takeaways. I think it's a very good suggestion. On the issue that Raj and, of course, the last lady who spoke, who brought up the individual emergencies and also the importance of the registration as by itself as an individual right. I think that's tremendously important. I fully agree with you. But also, I want to say that we know very little of the barriers and the barriers at country level. So we really have a knowledge gap of saying, without jumping into conclusion of coming up with a solution, we have to know the barriers. You have a lot of knowledge there, Raj, yourself, but we need to do a little bit more finding out what are the impediments for that.
Thank you very much, Cornelius.
I think actually it has been mentioned before, we need to look at the global humanitarian frameworks, the interagency groups, and make it an agenda item to build it into these frameworks. The vulnerability of women, unregistered, etc., is becoming a topic now, actually, across all the registration systems. And there is a possibility to use technology, and we need to build on people like UNHCR to have one functional registration, and then to use that functional registration for different things for women. And the final point, data protection. It's becoming a big issue now, and virtually all agencies are having issues about personal, individual data protection, and we should build a gender issue into it.
Okay, thank you very much. I will not attempt to summarize the rich discussion that went on, because I think that there are still a number of issues that we will be discussing with panelists when we are having coffee. But let me just give a few words that came from the discussion. One is that gender is not only a moral issue, it's a social and economic issue. So we need to deal with that. Second, we have to recognize that girls and women are part of vulnerable groups, and therefore, as a way of not leaving one behind, we need to tackle issues related to women and girls. They are most affected in emergency and disaster situation. Therefore, we need to integrate gender issues into CRVS systems, as opposed to coming up with ad hoc solutions, because we said it is a tall order, but there are already a number of issues going on to tackle this. But what we want to see is a holistic approach to make sure that these are dealt with by the full civil registration vital statistics system. And for that, we need to deal with a number of innovations, including revisiting the legal framework, addressing gender biases, dealing with business processes, and so on. There were so many examples that colleagues done. So I would like at this point in time to thank you, the panelists, and maybe give them a round of applause. Over to you, Master of Ceremony.
Thank you very much for this fantastic panel. It's a great start for the day and the lead for our the rest of the day with the labs. At this point, I would like to thank our online viewers because for joining us this morning. We regret we are not able to offer the webcasting for the remaining conference purely for logistical constraints on our side. The meeting is going to be happening in 6 different rooms with a whole bunch of audiovisuals, so it's just logistically not possible for us. But thank you, everyone. Just an update and announcements before we go into the lab format. The slight change of plan. So for the co-organizers of the conference, UNICEF and WHO, maybe we'll meet for during the coffee break now. And then for the lunchtime, we'll meet with the steering committee, please. Okay, the lab format. So the format for the remainder of the day today is a bit different from yesterday. We will have a 15-minute break, more or less. And we will then be breaking up into much smaller working group sessions. The outcome of these discussions will be integrated into the final conference report, which will be then made publicly available in English and French. So the upcoming sessions, we have 6 rooms, well, 5 rooms with one divided for the 6 labs. So this room, Hopper A and B, will have 2 labs. On my left, Innovation Lab 1, which is transforming CRVS systems, business process improvement to manage complexity. So that's on my left here. On my right, on the other side, is the Innovation Lab 2, which is on modern data analytics. So that is on the right here. Innovation Lab 3 on health and CRVS will take place next door in Hopper C, which is just across from this door. That is the one on health and CRVS. Innovation Lab 4 on human-centered design, increased demand and utilization of services through community partnerships will take place across the hall in the Pearson boardroom. So that's on the other side across from the elevators. Innovation Lab 5 on new technologies, blockchain and distributed ledgers, implications for CRVS and ID will take place in room 893, which is across the hall and to the left. So instead of going right to the Pearson boardroom, turn left through the corridor there, and you'll pass room 893 for the new technologies lab. Innovation Lab 6 on open systems, digital CRVS as a global good will take place in room 815, which is across the hall and to the right, next to where our lunch was held yesterday. Lunch will be served from 12:15 to 1:30. So please keep that for the moderators also of the labs to keep with that time. And as I mentioned this morning, our final closing session will start at 3:45. My last announcement or point is on the video opinions. I mentioned yesterday we have a video booth, and we'd really like to invite as many of you as possible to give us 60 seconds of your time to share your thoughts on a short list of questions that we have prepared for this. These are really great ways to share the wisdom and nuggets of your experience with others outside of this room. Those will be translated, interpreted, translated, and put on our website for a web platform for the benefit of others in the field. So please make the time during the break or one of the breaks. So now it's just left for me to say I wish you a very interesting and very useful labs. It's a really innovative idea. I think the whole organizing of the labs, we hope we will find it useful and informative, and it will hopefully give you more opportunity for interactive and engaging discussion. We'll see you later in the afternoon. Thank you very much.